We'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Margaret Briggs. I'm the MAFA president, and she muted me.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
You are.
Welcome. We are thrilled to see so many people here this evening. I think this has been our biggest turnout yet for one of the roundtables. I know we've got a lot of, I see guild folks that I recognize and probably some guests. So thank you all for being here. I do want to remind everyone, and we're going to keep posting the link in the chat periodically. We have a new page on the MAFA website where all the roundtable information, links to the details, and where the recordings are gonna live. So we should have that recording up tomorrow-ish. Give me till the afternoon because I've got stuff in the morning. And then all those recordings are going to now live on the new roundtables page on the MAFA website. And that's it for me.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I am going to ask you that if you have a question to put in the chat, if you could put a Q and then either a dash or a colon and then type your question. It makes this easier for us to sort through what's a question and what's just, you know, like a compliment, like best discussion I've ever heard in my life sort of thing. So we would appreciate that. And I'm going to spotlight Sarah Woodyard, our guest here for everyone, and we'll also take questions at the end. So now I should have Sarah. There she is. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
So just as a brief introduction, as the owner of Sewn Company, Sarah Woodyard is committed to hand sewing preservation as a teacher and practitioner. She teaches virtual hand sewing workshops, private lessons, and stitches custom hand-sewn clothing. Sarah became a journeywoman milliner and mantua maker in 2015, completing her 7-year apprenticeship at the Margaret Hunter Millinery Shop in Colonial Williamsburg, where she worked for 10 years. She holds her MA from the University of Alberta. So Sarah, it's all yours. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. Hello, everybody. Good evening, and hello to everyone who's watching the recording afterwards. Tonight, I really want to go behind the scenes of my 7-year apprenticeship that I served at the Margaret Hunter Millinery Shop from 2008 to 2015. And I served an apprenticeship in millinery and mantua making. Millinery is all the accessories and mantua making is essentially dressmaking. And tonight I want to talk about essentially just generally kind of like what I learned and like how I'm bringing those skills into the 21st century. And just kind of as a note, everything that I'm going to be talking about this evening are kind of my own opinions, my own experiences. I no longer work for Colonial Williamsburg, so I'm not representing the foundation in this discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, and as Sarah already mentioned, I just want to reiterate, yeah, please drop your questions like as you think of them. I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes, and then afterwards we can have a conversation and Q&A. Now, even though my apprenticeship was, my own experience and I worked through it on my own, it was still very much a collaborative experience. There are so many people who essentially helped teach me and guide me kind of through that, both people who are currently working there, have worked there, and also people from the past who I will never meet. And so it's really like the people that I'm the most interested in. And that's really what drew me to historical clothing, was being able to study an object and then see a person, kind of the traces of that person within the pleats and the stitching. And so I have this image up here on the screen to kind of begin, because though it is like this beautiful kind of sumptuous image of these like silk gowns, and it is quite lovely, I think someone earlier just called it luscious, which I thought was a lovely description. What I see people behind the scenes. I think of the stories, I think about the experiences, and these are all recreated garments that were made within the 20th century and the 21st century at the shop. But I see those stories. And so I want to talk about a little bit about the people before I kind of jump into a little bit about what I learned and how to apply that to today. So just really fast, like for example, like the green silk gown on the left-hand side, you're looking at the kind of the back of it with the cuffs. When I look at that gown, not only do I think those are really cool cuffs, and I'm so excited we got to do that project, but I also think about how I fit that gown to a very excited, eager young lady who was an intern of ours, who was so excited to have the opportunity to stand for a fitting. And then kind of by the contrast of that, I was cutting and fitting in front of a visiting public, because that's what we did at the shop, is we cut, fit, stitch, and interpret and talk about it and engage with people. And it was the first time I'd ever cut and fit a gown in front of a visiting public. So I was quite overwhelmed with the process as I was doing that. And it was such like a neat experience though, to kind of be simultaneously kind of learning both to, talk to people, but also, cutting and fitting and kind of practicing this trade in real time. On the right-hand side to that, kind of that peach colored silk gown with like the fluffy trim on it. When I look at that gown, I think of a woman named Brooke Barrows, who was my internship supervisor. Before I was an apprentice at the shop, I did intern when I was in college. And Brooke was the woman who really laid the foundation for me to understand really the basics of hand sewing and kind of walked me through lots of different projects. And this was her final apprenticeship piece. She was the apprentice before me. I took over her position when she left the shop. And to watch her do the research and recreate this garment and kind of bring a new light into certain definitions of gowns that we had been looking at prior to that was really inspiring. So as I look through these clothes, I think I look at like the inspiration, I look at kind of the realities of working in a museum, and just like the beautiful kind of the preservation that goes into all of the making of these pieces. Now, I mentioned earlier, but I want to kind of dive into a little bit more kind of before I continue, just a quick just kind of definitions of what millinery and mantua making are. So the shop that I worked at was run and owned by a woman named Margaret Hunter. And this is one of her advertisements. And it really gives a good selection of the types of things that were sold there. Of course, today in the 21st century, when we think millinery, we think hats, we think perhaps royal wedding, we think just headwear. But prior to the 19th century, millinery was all the pieces, the accessories, the complements, the decoration that goes on your clothing. So anything from a man's hat to his neckwear, to a woman's apron, to her jewelry, to her cap, to imported fabrics and things like shoes and buckles, that all came out of a shop. And Margaret was both sewing, well, her as well as people like Sal and Moll and other enslaved women were likely sewing clothing there at the shop. And then also the importation of ready-made pieces were sold there. So if we look at this picture, this is a garment that I worked on, I recreated from one of my final apprenticeship pieces. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit later, but just to highlight the millinery, all of the white stuff that you see there, that's millinery. So the headdress, the bow, the kind of wrapping around the shoulders, the little ruffles peeking out of the jacket, the ruffly apron, and also the shoes, the buckles, and the jewelry that she's wearing as well. All of that is millinery. So it kind of gives you a good kind of contrast to kind of visually see what that really means. It's the ornaments. It's not really extras at this time in history. And specifically, I'm referring to English fashion in the 1770s and 1780s that we see here in Virginia. Now, mantua making was 18th century dressmaking, and mantua making is more akin to modern day draping, where you take fabric and you wrap it around a figure and you cut and you fit the shapes right off of a three-dimensional object. At this point in history, there aren't public paper patterns available. Tailors are using more of a flat patterning technique, whereas a mantua maker tends to use a more three-dimensional method by wrapping, cutting, fitting, and so on. And so that's what I'm doing here in these images of I'm just wrapping the over top of a pair of stays, which is a structured bodice that women are wearing at this time. That gives a beautiful shape, and it also gives a place to then fit things on top of. So here you can really kind of see what I'm referring to. the method with which a lot of mantua makers used is they would actually cut out the lining pieces first. So if you're familiar with draping, you might be familiar with the idea of like a muslin and using cheaper fabric to cut out your shapes and then adjust them and then make a flat pattern from that. In this time period, it's a little bit different. They're actually utilizing the textiles that are going to be integral to the clothing. So taking the white linen lining or a check linen lining or just the lining and laying that on the body, cutting and fitting, taking it off, stitching it together, and then building the outer pieces on top of that. That's kind of the technique that's being used. So in the top right-hand side, you can see, like for example, in the center there, the center back piece, and then as we kind of radiate out, going towards the center front. So the curves that are kind of emanating out at the bottom, that's actually where the hip is. The little curve above that is the underarm, and then those straight straps, that's actually going over the shoulder. And so you see like the kind of this two-dimensional and then what it looks like kind of on a three-dimensional form. Mantua making, as is millinery, were trades. They are skilled work that was learned through an apprenticeship, and in Virginia were practiced both by free and also enslaved women, such as like Sarah, for example, who's listed in this advertisement. And a lot of the work that I've done is studying historical examples and then recreating those processes. And before I go any further, I really want to honor and remember a lot of the stitchers, mantua makers, milliners who are not often remembered or spoken of. And those are people who are part of the African diaspora who were in bondage and were enslaved and did this work. They didn't do it out of choice, but they had to. Specifically at the Margaret Hunter shop, Aga, Jenny, Millie, Sal, Will, and Shavers, as well as children were at the shop, made that shop possible. And in essence, made it possible kind of in a more abstract way for me to even work there, because the shop would not have existed without their work, without the labor of those people. Furthermore, Sarah, Charlotte, Caroline, specifically Charlotte and Caroline, as well as Oni Judge, those are people that were up at Mount Vernon. And it is likely that I've actually learned from those women some of the skills that I possess, because there's a cap up at Mount Vernon that I studied for my master's thesis that I believe was stitched by one of those women, probably, well, maybe Charlotte, maybe Caroline. And so I've likely learned directly from some of the people on this list. Sal, Alice, Brassmall, Cinna, Betty, Sarah, Lucy, and also all the unnamed. So the other names on the list are from people who were in Virginia, self-liberated themselves, and we know from advertisements. So I just want to take a moment to really just acknowledge their contributions to the fashion industry here in America, and acknowledge that a lot of people sewing at this time did not look like Betsy Ross. They weren't sewing flags. And if they were sewing flags, but they may not have been a white person sewing a flag. So it's really is a lot more enslaved work than maybe is discussed. Now we're kind of referring back to that idea of like the people. So like the people I just mentioned, they're crucial. They're part of this story because they made all these skill sets possible. Also the people today that I worked with who were part of that collaborative experience at the shop. So I mentioned, I touched on them earlier, but showing some of their faces. The woman on the left-hand side is Brooke Barrows. She was the apprentice before me, and she was my internship supervisor. Jenny Whitaker to her right was the mistress of the shop, and she's the woman who wrote the curriculum that I went through, and she still works there today. That's me next to her. And then a woman named Abby Cox, who was an apprentice at the shop when I became a journeywoman, and she has subsequently moved on to other roles. So one of my kind of favorite collaborative experiences at the shop, and kind of going back to this notion of it being a trade, was we would often do programs called Gown in a Days. And some of you here might have actually gotten a chance to experience those. That was probably one of my favorite things to do at the shop. Is what we would do is take a day and we would make a gown in a day. So for example, the lady on the left-hand side wearing that bright green wool gown, which is actually indigo and turmeric over-dyed. And then the woman on the right-hand side is wearing a hand-woven fabric. Annie actually used to work at the weave room at Colonial Williamsburg. But the three people on the right-hand side on the up on the steps, and then the people on the other side, we were in teams. We were racing. So we were racing to see who could get that gown done in a day. And the reason we would do these gown in a days is because we know that those fitted pieces could be made in about 10, 11, 12 hours. So they can be made very quickly. And of course, this is all hand stitched. There aren't sewing machines in the 1770s and the 1780s. Everything is powered by needle and thread and a person. So again, that idea of industry, the idea of fast work, the idea that this is a trade was something that was really kind of, we talked a lot about. And that was something that Janae Whitaker, again, the mistress of the shop here, she was kind of pivotal in demonstrating that to make both millinery and mantua making considered official trades within the trades department at the museum. So when you think of trade work, you might think, oh, carpentry and blacksmiths and silversmiths, but you may not think of mantua making and millinery, these female-dominated trades, as being part of that list. And she was able to demonstrate and prove that they were apprenticeship trades in Williamsburg as well as elsewhere within the Atlantic world at this time. So once again, she is the woman who wrote the curriculum that I'm going to kind of walk you through or talk about kind of what I learned in that. And it is something that, again, was very collaborative. And we're all kind of building on each other's knowledge and sharing knowledge as we go through it, as well as it was quite iterative, because what she wrote and did with Brooke was different than what I did and what was different than Abby did and subsequently other apprentices who have come after me. So the organization of the apprenticeship there was essentially 7 key elements, and mine was written to be 7 years. It has subsequently been reduced to 5 years. But to work well with her needle, to be a seamstress, cutting by geometry, millinery in all its branches, cutting to the body, cutting by other methods, and then final projects. So that was how it was organized. To work well with her needle was, in essence, learning how to sew. That wasn't anything more than that. It was literally, knowing how to thread a needle, knowing how to do back stitches, running stitches, and so on. Now, since I had done an internship when I was in college, I had kind of checked that portion off of the list when I came to the shop. So I didn't really work too long in that particular section. So I want to start with to be a seamstress. And within all these sections, I'm just going to share like 1 or 2 images of some projects that I did and talk about my experience. So to be a seamstress means being like an excellent hand stitcher. Essentially, what you're trying to do is train yourself to be very good at hand sewing, because once again, there's no sewing machine. And so, you are the sewing machine, right? In essence. And a seamstress or a semster, which is the male version of that word in the 18th century, in, again, the Atlantic world is where I'm referring. Those people were really good at sewing linen. They were really good at sewing things that might have been even cut out for them and then stitched together. So this is a shift that was owned by a woman named Anne Van Rensselaer in New York State. She was a woman of Dutch descent. And you can kind of see, just by even looking at it with the Black background, how it is kind of a geometric object. The sleeves are rectangles, underarm gussets are actually squares. The body is actually a rectangle with gores that are triangles that are attached to the bottom. So we're looking at very efficient kind of zero waste cutting technology that you kind of see across the world for like hundreds and hundreds of years. And then it's like straight seaming. But these straight seams have to be extremely fine and very strong, because a garment like this was worn against the body, and that's what would absorb oils, dirt, perspiration, and then that gets taken off, then that gets laundered. So it has to be strong. So there's kind of, and I'm probably preaching, to the choir here, because you all are hand workers, but oftentimes people will be like, but it's hand sewn, so it's going to be really weak and it's not going to be strong. But this particular garment really counteracts that idea. These are extremely well stitched objects that are intended to be boiled and scrubbed and scoured every time they're worn. And so I studied it, and then I made kind of my own version of it. So here are some examples of my stitches. From the left, on the left-hand side there, they are essentially a little band. It's called a wristband that would go around the upper arm and tie, or have little sleeve links that would hold that together. And then on the right-hand side, top stitching that goes over top of the shoulder. And then the gathers that you see on the right-hand side, that's the sleeve that's been set into the shoulder area. So you can see the fineness that's being stitched on some of these objects. And that stitching that looks like a sewing machine is all hand done. Nothing that I sewed in that shop is done by a machine. The way that I was able to achieve uniformity like this, like you see in the original shift that I just showed you, is just by counting threads. So following one yarn across the way and then counting as you go so that you're only stitching over so many threads, and it's a back stitch that is used in order to create that detail. The strip over the shoulder is just intended for kind of reinforcement. I would say that this is probably one of my favorite types of sewing to do, is that fine stitching on linen, which I've really continued on in my practice today. Kind of the next year, the next focus was cutting by geometry. And that means being able to cut out cloaks, aprons, neckwear, caps without using any kind of paper template. The idea of a pattern in the 18th century in Virginia, in England, wasn't what we think of today. So for example, you can't go to a store and buy, a piece of paper, put into a paper envelope, unfurl it, lay it on your fabric and cut it out and have a garment. Instead, the idea of a pattern was actually a finished object that you would have and then replicate based off of the finished object. So for example, like what I'm wearing in this picture on the right-hand side, this is a linen cap. If I wanted to have that same exact cap made, I might take it off my head, take it to the milliner and say, please make a cap from this pattern. So it's the object that's considered like the example with which to then make something else. And so that was something that they did in the 18th century. And that's exactly what we did today by studying the original pieces, as well as garments that had already been made in the shop, to better understand the shapes and the designs as we kind of experimented our way to better understand historic trades. So the picture on the right-hand side is the three-dimensional object. The picture on the left-hand side is that in two-dimensional pieces. So they look like weird face or kind of like a little abstract art. But if we kind of break it down, you can see the strips on the top, those really narrow, thin pieces. Those would be considered, you might call it a ruffle. They were calling them borders. So it's just a little ruffle around my face. The two pieces that look kind of like winking eyes, that's called the band, and that goes in between the ruffle and the back of the cap. And then the piece below it, very domed section, that's referred to as a caul, C-A-U-L, and that's what everything is attached to, and that's what holds the hair, and it kind of gathers drawstrings at the back to hold it on the head. So that's what the cap looks like when it's cut out. So I was taught to cut that out without relying on a paper template. I instead relied on basic measurements and doing things like pin marking and using pencil to draw on the fabric and then cutting from there. We also explored this idea of millinery and all of its branches. So the core millinery would be those accessories, those decorations, but it actually went beyond that. So for example, one of the women in the shop, either Aga, Jenny, Millie, or Sal, they were a fine clear starcher, and fine laundry was an aspect of the millinery business. And so we would research things like clear starching. So the cap that I was wearing, for example, would have been dipped into a pot of starch, pressed with a hot iron in order to give body to that item, as well as the starch protects the textile itself from being penetrated with any kind of dirt, be it hair oil or just like dirt from the environment. So that cleanliness element was something that was also practiced in the millinery trade, as well as at the specific shop that I used to work at. But another aspect of the branches were things like embroidery, making baby clothes, trim making, which is what I'm doing here in this picture. So I kind of went down this like deep dive rabbit hole. I'm sure some of you can relate to making these like little delicate trims. I got really excited about spending lots and lots of time tying little tiny fringes to make these little tiny decorative elements. And then I wove them into a long tape using a tabletop box loom. So the one on the left-hand side is actually a ribbon that was already pre-woven, and I put a silk ribbon or silk thread underneath the ribbon to make kind of like this little section, like a little core, to then wrap around the ribbon at intervals and then hold those little fringes in place. Then on the right-hand side, I just inserted as a supplemental weft as I went to make this little tiny fringe. So that was one of the kind of branches that I explored, was the trim making, and then also a little bit about the fine clear starching. And then getting to the mantua making part of part of kind of the program, which again is dressmaking. And mantua makers at this time, though I started with showing you silk gowns, that actually wasn't necessarily like the core item that all mantua makers are making. At this point in history, the labor is nominal. Again, it's either done by somebody who is an enslaved worker, or it's done by somebody who is getting paid very, very little for their work. So the expense of your clothing at this time is the textile, and the textile would be chosen by the customer and then provided to the person to then cut out and make the clothing for them. So if you're a blacksmith, like Ashlyn is here, you're going to buy fabric that's utilitarian, it's sturdy, and it's good for the job that you do. And there were female blacksmiths in the 18th century, and I loved making her clothing because it was so interesting to see how did it function, how did it wear. And I felt like it really dispelled a lot of myths for me of the idea of, oh, well, if something's really fitted, she's not going to have range of motion. It was actually the opposite. I could talk to her about her needs and how she needed to move in her clothes. And by setting the sleeve quite high under the arm, and specifically for her, she was able to safely do the work that she needed to do, and was very comfortable while she did it. This gown lasted for at least 4 years with a couple of repairs. And so it lasted quite long, and it was made out of a relatively durable linen. I also made nicer clothes too. This is a really nice chintz. It was a reproduction of a cotton textile that was imported from India in the 18th century. And here I am setting the skirt onto the bodice. If anyone is familiar with kind of modern sewing, 20th century, 21st century sewing, typically the idea is that you finish the garment and then you hem it. In the 18th and 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you typically hem your skirt first, and then you actually attach it to the waist. And that's where you level it out to make a nice, even hemline. So that's what I'm doing here in this picture. So my final apprentice project was really these culminating pieces. I had 3 garments that 3 projects, or 3 aspects of the project, I should say, that I needed to make. So I had to first make an exact reproduction from an object in a collection, which was always kind of my favorite thing to do, was studying the real stuff. Because again, going back to the idea of like the people, like I loved seeing what people had made and how they made it. I had to, quote unquote, practice the trade, meaning I had to make clothing that fit an actual person, and then using things like visual sources, written documentation, or original pieces to kind of back up that choice. And then I had kind of a free-for-all. I could kind of do whatever I wanted. She just called it make an apprenticeship piece, but it could kind of do like whatever I wanted it to be. So I chose to recreate this cap, which is a cap that was worn by a Quaker woman, probably in the 1790s, but it is a style that's quite ubiquitous to Quaker headdress that you see worn through the kind of the mid-19th century. It's made out of a very fine cotton, and I love the delicate hand sewing, partly because I think I just enjoy the process of doing fine hand sewing, but then I also enjoy the effect of seeing something that's been hand stitched exquisitely, being overwhelmed by how lovely it is and thinking I could never do it, and then practicing enough to prove myself that I can do it too. So that kind of ability to show like, oh, I am capable, I can do that, that's really cool, is maybe just like a fun exercise that I enjoy. I don't know, but I love doing the fine hand sewing. And so that's partly why I'm drawn to caps specifically. So on the left-hand side, that's a detail of the kind of a drawstring section. I go back here, you can see there's like a piece that kind of hangs down that would tie under the chin or just hang on either side, depending on how someone was wearing it. And so that's my version of that. Essentially, it's 2 pieces of fabric that have been hemmed and then at intervals whipped together to actually close the holes to make the little eyelets where you then draw the cord through. And this is the finished product being modeled by Rebecca Starkins, who currently works at the shop, and she is a journeywoman. And then the other project that I did was I wanted to recreate all of the women's pieces in this particular print. This is one of the very few images we have of milliners working in the Atlantic world during this time period. And also one of the very few pictures we have of women specifically stitching. I was really interested in the clothing because I like the styles, but also all of the meanings that go into this print. You actually can learn a lot about the culture and the opinions of milliners by looking at like the names of the boxes and like what's happening in the image and so on. And I found this print always quite fascinating. So I wanted to dig deeper into it to understand its meaning, but then also to recreate it. So I went on and looked at images, extant clothes, written descriptions to kind of better understand the early 1780s. There were a lot of pieces from the print that the shop really hadn't made before. Like, for example, there's like this 2-split bum that no one had ever really explored before. So I was kind of experimenting with that as I went along, as well as these different types of jackets and trims. It was just kind of a new place to go, and that was very fun for me. So this is another, I showed you this earlier, but this is one of the garments that is in that print. And for this particular outfit, we did this as one of those kind of gown in a day work days, or maybe it was a 2-day work day. I pre-cut all of the millinery. And then on that work day, we had a whole slew of people working on different facets of the sewing. And then I did the cutting and the fitting for the jacket on that day. And so we put the entire ensemble together in a day, but I had pre-cut it, like full disclosure, but it was very neat to see it all come together very quickly. And then this was the final kind of tableau that we put together. And the tailors that worked in our shop together, we did that kind of simultaneously and all worked together. And I did a whole lecture talking about the print. And then at the very end, we all came together and sat down and kind of brought it to life. So then in 2015, I got my Journey Woman's papers. I am wearing a hand-sewn dress in the picture. So I completed those pieces. And actually, to finish my apprenticeship, it was kind of, I did the recreation of that print that you saw. And then I did take a leave of absence from my job, and I went and I got my master's degree in material culture at the University of Alberta. And then I came back, I finished the CAP, and then I got my Journey Woman's papers. And so then from 2015 to 2018, I worked as a journeywoman. And I continued to make clothing for women who worked in the trades department. This is a woman who worked at the wheelwright shop. Once again, listening to her, figuring out kind of what she needed for her role and what was best for her job. And then I also loved working and collaborating with other museums. I led a team to recreate these 2 figures, 2 Quaker women, and these are at the Museum of the American Revolution up in Philadelphia. And then also working with other coworkers to help them make clothing for themselves to then wear as they interpreted 18th century life and culture. This is a woman named Cheney McKnight who no longer works at Colonial Williamsburg, but I helped cut out a petticoat and a shift for her that she wears to interpret the life of a Black woman in the 18th and early 19th century. She hand sews herself, and she currently runs a business called Not Your Mama's History. You should look her up on YouTube, Patreon, Instagram, all of those places. Learned so much from Cheney McKnight. So really enjoyed working with her on this project. Also would do other things as a journeywoman, things that you wouldn't expect. There was a lot of behind the scenes stuff that I would do, be it intern supervision or just general kind of admin, answering emails. But one of the things that I did before I left was I co-chaired the National Costume Society of America conference in March of 2018. So here I am kind of behind the scenes putting together the slate of talks. And we called it Making Connections because this whole notion that making is a form of research. Making pulls up all this knowledge and information that you wouldn't necessarily understand about something without actually doing the thing. And then in 2018, in the fall, I decided it was time to move on to kind of the next step in my journey. So I truly am kind of a journey woman at this point. I kind of see myself as someone who's completed that apprenticeship, really learned these skill sets, and now I'm kind of journeying and bringing it into that next phase. And so when I was at the shop, it made sense why I spent all day, every day, hand sewing, because I was there to educate. I was there to preserve trades, educate a visiting public, and that was my job, and that made sense. But I still felt the need and the desire to continue on this kind of work even after after I was done with working at the museum. And these are some of the reasons why I find hand sewing beneficial and why I continue to hand sew and why I still have it as my job. Of course, one of the things is that strong connection to the past. I really love, again, looking at the actual pieces, the actual objects, and seeing the stitches of those anonymous stitchers who've kind of come before us, either connecting to those people I don't know or even connecting to people in my own family. I have a lot of hand quilters in my family. So I really feel that connection to those people when I personally sew. And then the preservation of a skill, I think it's extremely important that if you're able to do some sort of task using your body to kind of power that task. So it might be sewing for some people, of course, that is kind of my choice, I guess, mode of work, but it could be weaving, spinning, woodworking, cooking, but just the fact that, returning to ourselves to and preserving the skills that we have done for thousands and thousands of years as humans, I think is an extremely important thing to remember and not lose. I also see these skills as research. Again, that idea that as we make, we learn so much about the people who came before, and through that experience and through just the skill set that was required to even create something. Beyond that, things like mental health. I'm sure a lot of you can relate that kind of rhythmic experience of creating something, be it weaving or spinning or knitting. For me, that rhythmic nature of stitching really helps to ground me. And I believe it kind of does the same thing that like meditation can do for your brain. It really helps to kind of clear your head, ground you, and kind of allow you to think clearer. I find that on days that I'm feeling scattered and very stressed out, if I sit for just 15 minutes and start sewing, I immediately kind of clear that bad energy out, and I feel much better. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but that sense of accomplishment, I mean, there's nothing like it to be able to look at something that you didn't think you can do and then create it, which is really, really remarkable. So now I kind of take what I learned and I've brought it into the 21st century, and I still teach people how to make historical pieces, but doing so with the idea of you can wear these things today, as well as being creative and taking my knowledge and kind of the baseline skill in making clothing that can be worn in a modern context. So for example, this dress style that I have put, these are two dresses that are the same design. I stitch these using the techniques that I learned from studying old linen pieces. So those, like the shift that I showed you earlier, this garment is stitched using the exact same techniques that I learned when I made that shift. And then the way that I cut it out was also without using any kind of pattern, but it's actually all one piece of fabric. And there's a theory of cutting for looser jackets at this time in history, where you fold the fabric at the shoulder, you don't have a shoulder seam, and you just cut a neckline out, or you kind of cut it up the center front, depending on what style you're making. And then you cut curves under the arm so it fits across the body. So it's fitted, but it's also not as fitted as, say, like the jackets and gowns I was showing you earlier. And then the stitching, again, is what I learned on those shifts. So on the left-hand side, this is a felled seam where you stitch this fabric together, you open the seam up, you fold over your edges, and then you fell them in place. The felling stitch particularly is such a neat, fantastic stitch. It's my favorite because it's so versatile. That's something that I learned through this apprenticeship, was this idea that you can have one stitch and then have all these different applications for that one stitch. And just like learning through the experience of spending 7 years studying something, I learned very quickly, okay, this particular project will warrant this version of this stitch, or this type of fabric is going to warrant this type of thread or this type of needle, and just kind of that embodied learning you only get through that experience. So again, kind of applying it to this modern piece, but still referencing back those old technologies. The same is true with like mending. On the right-hand side, this is an example of mending. It's not visible. I know it's very trendy right now for people to do visible mending, but in 18th century Virginia, you didn't want your mend to be seen. You wanted it to be invisible. And so you looked to kind of put together. So what you would do is cut your hole out, turn back those raw edges by basting them using like a big stitch to hold them temporarily, lay that patch underneath, and then just fell that down. It's the same stitch you use for like applique. It's the same stitch I used for doing that felled seam. And this is a closer up picture of the seam specifically. So again, you do right sides together, did a running stitch with the occasional back stitch, which is known as a combination stitch, fold over those raw edges, and then fell them down. So the angled stitch, that's your felled stitch. And then the straight stitch there, that's the combination stitch. The great thing about linen is that you can get really close to the fiber and follow one yarn across the way. So you can work very precisely as you stitch. A couple other examples of how I like to apply that felling technique or that stitch is in other seaming examples. This is a seam known as a mantua maker's hem, but it's actually a seam where you in essence put your fabric right sides together, you offset it, and then you fold your fabric up twice and then you fell that all the way through. If you are familiar with sewing, you might say, well, that looks like a French seam. That is an encased kind of a self-encased seam is what a French seam is, but a mantua maker seam is also self-encased and it has a little bit of like a ridge that kind of peeks up from the stitching line. But this is the hand sewing version of a French seam. French seams didn't really take off until the sewing machine kind of came on the scene in the 19th century. So this is a very fast, very effective way to finish off a seam if you're using lightweight fabric. Something else that I learned that is very much like divorced really from modern sewing techniques and theory is that today people are taught to finish all of the edges, but historically a lot of the times long seams that didn't have any stress on them, you would just put the fabric together and do a little combination stitch and then you'd be done. So you might have even just like a raw edge on your skirt, or you might have a raw edge under the arm. Part of that is the fabric that they had then. We don't have that maybe quality of fabric today. That said, some fabrics like quilters cottons and certain tightly woven textiles, you can still get away with just a cut edge and not have to worry about it fraying. The other thing too that they would utilize is the entire width of the textile. Today, people with sewing are taught to cut off a selvage, but historically you would use the entire width of the fabric and the selvage would stay intact and it was already finished. So why would you cut it off? So that would also be used often on the interior of seams. This gathering technique, this is a closer up example of the cap that I showed you earlier, but this is a beautiful self-finished gathering technique that is fantastic for historic sewing, but also for modern sewing. I have an on-demand class of historic gathering techniques, and some of my students have used this technique to do like a modern skirt, and it looks fantastic. This little ruffle here is hemmed by doing a rolled hem. So just taking the fabric and rolling it in between the layers of your fingers. So it's like this beautiful kind of lofty kind of curl, and then you stitch that down. Then on the other side, to actually create the ruffle itself, you roll the ruffle and then you take your thread and you stitch around it. And then you can pull that thread and that gathers it up. And so it does this really, I think it's very cool, this cool thing where it simultaneously is encasing your fabric and it's also making a gather. And then that gather can be attached to another piece of fabric. And that's what you see in this picture. Another detail of some really lovely gathers. Now, the last one is called a rolled whip gather. You might have heard that term before. This particular example is known as a stroke gathering, where instead of stitching around the fabric, this particular detail here is actually the neck area on a shirt. And you take 2 rows of running stitches, so those straight stitches that are parallel to one another, and then you pull the fabric across that thread, and then that cinches up the fabric and makes a really lovely gathered piece that you can then attach a collar or a cuff to, but it helps to manipulate the fabric. And you might notice if you look really closely along the edge there, where you see those gathered kind of ridges are intersecting with that line, there's little tiny felling stitches. So each ridge is stitched to the collar. So again, very strong, but it also is a really lovely effect. Kind of continuing on in this idea of like pleats and gathers and controlling of the fabric. this is a detailed image of the first gown that I ever made, and it's the back of the gown. So the line that you see kind of in the center of the picture, that's considered the back, the center back of the gown. And then you have two pleats. You have two pieces of fabric that are kind of pinched and then folded back down and stitched to create that really lovely kind of angled line that continues down towards the back of the waist of the gown and then actually continues on into the skirt. All of this is stitched from the exterior. That's also something that you see more historically than you see kind of in a modern capacity. There's a lot more top stitching that happens specifically on seams and skirt seams and pleats and so on. So there's a lot, it's just kind of, I think, it's very strong and sturdy. Let me show you a detail here. So the knife pleats, that's the skirt. It's like a huge amount of fabric that gets folded in on itself. And then you insert it underneath a finished line, and then you just do a little back stitch to top stitch that on in place. So again, beautiful and also quite sturdy. I'm just forever amazed by how efficient these garments are put together by hand and how well they finish things off, or where they don't finish things off, and how fun, like okay that is when it comes to the sewing. If you were to sew a gown like this by machine, it requires you to completely rethink the order of operations. But when you sew it by hand, it flows together so efficiently because everything it makes sense because it was designed to be stitched by hand. Another example of a waist, this is a petticoat, which is essentially like a skirt. And in this instance, what I did was I pleated the fabric to fit the waist. And then there's a woven linen tape that has a nice finished selvage edge that just binds the top of the skirt, and then doing a little tiny angled felled seam there. Now, like I was saying earlier, I'm still kind of continuing to teach and study all of these pieces. So I showed you some examples of some recreated pieces. This is an example of a 19th century chemise, which is very much akin to an 18th century shift that I'm currently in the process of teaching a class about. So I've walked my students through studying the chemise, cutting out their own chemises, and then hand sewing those chemises. And a lot of the people that are in the class are going to be wearing this as a modern dress to kind of bring it into today. And so using those old technologies and still making it quite relevant. And if you're interested to do your own practice to kind of remember what your hands can do, I guess, that's one of my taglines. I do have a YouTube channel with a variety of different tutorials that you can follow to make different types of seams and learn different types of stitches. And then I also, if you want to support my work and as well as dive into more kind of deeper stuff, I do have a Patreon where you pay a monthly fee to have access to a library of on-demand classes. The two tiers, the higher tiers, the silver thimble and the workshop tier, give you access to a library of on-demand classes. And this is just actually a handful of them. There's more than what I'm showing here. But like the tunic I'm wearing, I have a class on. Margaret took my apron class, hand-rolled hems, napkins, just a lot of different classes to really kind of dig into this notion that you actually can make garments and clothes by hand. So I'll just kind of end with that idea of like really remembering what your hands can do, which I think you all understand that because you all love to make as well. But I hope that you will, maybe this will inspire you to pick up a needle and try your hands at some hand sewing if you haven't done that. Or if you used to hand sew, maybe trying it again, kind of reigniting that interest in making clothing by hand. So if you'd like to kind of follow me after and kind of keep in touch, my Patreon is Sewn Company. My website is sewncompany.com. And then on Instagram, I'm Sewn Stories. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. And I'm really excited to hear your questions and have a conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. Patty, do you want to do the chat?
Sure. We have a couple questions. The first one is, did you have to use flat irons in the shop?
No. We didn't have to use flat irons in the shop. Our iron was upstairs and it was plugged into the wall. And part of the reason why we didn't use flat irons is because actually a lot of millinery and mantua making, you don't need an iron to put that together. So those knife plates that I showed you, the fabric is medium to lightweight, so you can finger press it, or you can use basting to hold the textile down where you need it to be and then sew it together. That is one of the benefits to this type of stitching, is that you don't have to sew something, get up and iron it, and then come back down and sew it and then go iron it. Whereas the tailoring trade typically used heavier weight textiles and they relied more heavily on an iron. And the tailors that we worked with from time to time would heat up the fireplace and use what are known as gooses, which are long, narrow irons. Or we would do that for like a laundry program to talk to people about that.
All right, here's another one. Can you recommend a book on the art of hand sewing? I'm particularly interested in the rolled whip gather stitch.
Yeah, I do have an on-demand class, so you can take my class if you're interested to learn that. And then if you're interested in a book, there's a book called, of course, I'm forgetting the name. Let me look it up and I'll put it in the chat. It's by Louisa Sundstrom, and it's actually, hold on, let me just go get it and I'll show it to you. I have it, I just like have it over here. And I think she might have taught you how to do it. I don't know.
And I think the next question, do you give online classes, is already self-evident from your presentation.
Okay, so the name of the book is Hand Sewing Clothing, a Guide. Looks like this. She is also, if you're on Instagram, she's on Instagram, and this is for sale. And it has like a really lovely, I'm not sure if the whip gather technique is in here. I'd have to double check, but it has just a lovely step-by-step, images, of different types of stitching. So Hand Sewn Clothing, a Guide, Louisa Owen Sundstrom.
All right, during your apprenticeship, how much background reading and research did you have to do in the addition to the sewing?
A fair amount. Part of that was part of the apprenticeship. So the apprenticeship had a reading list, and then every so often we would go to collections either at Colonial Williamsburg or at another institution to study objects. That was definitely a foundation of the understanding of the pieces.
Okay. And how long would it take you to make a dress on your own? A day, right? Down in a day.
Yeah. So my boss, she clocked herself at like 11 hours or 10 hours and some minutes, like close to 11 hours. I never time myself to that level. I think I could make one in about 14 hours.
All right, here's the question about using, do you need to use really high quality fabric, and was it hard to find the fabric? And do you have some recommendations for sources?
Yeah. Yeah, so it definitely was a concession that has to be made, is that historic textiles, specifically linens, just you cannot find that quality of linen today is what they used to create. So you all understand that notion of like, long line linen. I mean, you occasionally you can find that on the modern market, but it's not really readily available. Modern linen, of course, as you know, gets chopped up in a cotton machine. And so the fibers are super short. And so you don't have that same tightly packed, dense fabric that is also at the same time very lightweight that you see historically. So we'd have to make concessions in linen, the cotton, same thing. It's just not the fineness of the spinning and the quality of the fiber. It sounds like so cliche, but like it just isn't as good as it used to be, because that's not where the industry is focused.
What weight of thread do you use, and brand of needles, and size of needle?
Depends on the fabric that I'm working with. So, okay, so like the garment I'm wearing right now, this is a really lightweight cotton from India from a company called 1111. And I love sharp needles, not actual, well, obviously I like sharp needles, but the type of needle that is known as a sharp. So a sharp or embroidery needle are my two favorite types of needles to sew with, because they are a relatively longer needle in the realm of hand sewing needles. Whereas like a quilter's needle tends to be quite short and small, and I don't like to sew clothing with that type of needle. A darner's needle or a beading needle, way too long. You don't want to use that for hand sewing unless you're doing some sort of mending. I like size, for this one, it's lightweight. So like a size 10, 11. For medium weight linen, I like a size like 9. For something a little bit heavier, maybe a size 7 needle, maybe even a 5. Like if you're sewing heavy denim, a size 5 might be good. The lower the number of the needle, the more heavier it is, the more heavy duty. The higher the number of the needle, the finer it is.
Okay. And when you sewed the gathered skirt to the bodice, did you sew it together first face to face and then top stitch it on the right side?
No.
Okay.
No. So that's a difference between a modern way of sewing. Yeah, right sides together, stitch it and flip it, right? And then go back over and do the top stitching. No, instead, relying on, again, that idea of basting, what I did was I took the bodice, you baste back the bodice, you pleat your skirt and you slide your skirt underneath that folded edge, and then you top stitch. And then the lining is left open, and then you fold your lining over top of the stitching line. So you do have 2 rows of stitching at the waist. You've got your top stitching, and then you have the lining that gets felled into place. So a lot of just turning of the fabric and basting it and kind of preparing it.
Here's a question about preparing for weight gain. Kim thought that pleats were for growth.
They can be, sure. A lot of it has to do with the idea that the fabric's expensive. So there's minimal cutting that happens in the skirt. And also the style of it was to have these like really voluminous skirts. So it's kind of both. It's one, we want to be able to take this apart, knowing we're going to take it apart later and have it remade into something new, be it for ourselves or for someone else in the family, or it might go on the secondhand market and then just be purchased by someone else and then it gets altered for them. So it can be remade into new sizes and new designs.
Here's a good one. Do you wear out your sewing needles?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And have you ever teamed up with a weaver who could create cloth for you to work with?
Yeah, when I worked at the shop, we did. So we did collaborate with the weaving shop at Colonial Williamsburg to make fabric and to dye fabric that we would sew with. But I haven't done it yet as like a business owner. I am interested to do that specifically. I have a 19th century shirt, a hand sewn shirt that I taught a class on last year. And you need the fabric to be a certain width for it to kind of do the right thing, to get the right dimensions. And I would love to team up with a weaver to make like a really high quality linen or hemp. And I have touched base with a weaver that I know in Vermont who is open and interested in the project. And I have to just kind of pursue that more.
That's great. And here's an aspirational question. How long does it usually take for someone who hasn't sewn since childhood and wasn't very good at it to confidently do basic stitches well?
I can't speak to how long. I would imagine that if you were familiar with the notion of threading a needle and holding a needle, that if you were to practice kind of every day for like a month, you probably would get pretty adept at it.
And here's a question about smocking and when was that developed in history?
For specifically in European clothing, you start to see, so that the shirts that guys are wearing, there's like an oversized version of that, and they call it a smock. And it's something that a lot of farmers or laborers or people who are doing a lot of dirty work, they would do. So it was like a really sturdy, big shirt, essentially, that was worn over top of their clothes. Well, sometime in like maybe like the 1790s, I want to say, you start to see that volume of fabric start to get decorated and controlled by kind of an early version of what people know of smocking today.
And looks like a question here. Who made the men's clothing?
So the milliners would make men's accessories. And then mantua makers, sometimes I've seen references of mantua makers advertising that they would make things like trousers and shirts. And trousers are a little bit less fitted, but oftentimes it was a tailor who would make fitted lower body garments and waistcoats and coats and jackets.
Great. I think that there are a lot of compliments in the chat and comments, but that's about it for questions.
If anybody else has a question, we have a lot of people here. So under reactions, if you're not on an iPad or a phone, you can raise your hand. We should be able to see your name and your hand in the chat. If anybody has any, but we have a few other questions here.
Yep, here it just came up. Did tailors make coats for women?
Yeah, sometimes. So there is a style of garment that women would wear, which is known as a riding habit, which is like an upper body garment that looks more like a man's suit. So there would be a coat with that. Mm-hmm. There's also a style that's known as, well, there's debate. There's another style of garment that tailors might have made, but oftentimes outer garments are cloaks that are made by milliners.
Okay. And what types of threads do you prefer?
I like silk and linen.
Okay. And let's see, how do you tell if a sewing needle is wearing out?
When you try to put it through your fabric and it doesn't go through, or it starts to curve so badly that you can't put it through at the right angle.
Here's a question. Where is the best place to start for someone who wants to make hand stitch clothing? I would think it's your Patreon.
Yeah, I mean, you can join Patreon. I have a variety of classes that are designed for essentially like basics to more evolved, not evolved, but more like harder stitching. And then also my YouTube channel, there's like really a phenomenal amount of resources there. I would honestly recommend, if you're interested to learn how to hand sew, it sounds kind of basic, but like make a napkin. Just cut out a napkin, because then you can learn how to baste. And basting is such a key skill, and basting is temporary. So it's like big, messy stitches. So there's like no pressure at all. So I would recommend my napkin hemming class.
Okay. And here's the question. Have you ever worked with Tryon Palace in New Bern?
I don't think I've made anything for them. I mean, I'm familiar with them, and I'm trying to remember if we ever did anything when we were at the shop, because we would often collaborate with other museums. I can't remember, honestly.
And did you have a lot of know-how about sewing when you started?
I had some. I dabbled in hand sewing through my childhood. I really loved it, but I didn't do it all the time. And then when I went to college, well, no, senior year of high school, I was able to do an independent study where I learned French heirloom sewing techniques. And then I really delved into working in costume shops in college. But I mean, really, like, the hand sewing didn't like solidify and become more of a daily thing for me until after I did an internship between my junior and senior year of college at the shop, because I did it every day and I loved it so much that I kept doing it.
And that's it for questions in the chat.
Okay, here's one more.
Oh, you're right. Can you tell us about your necklace?
There's a question before. Yeah, I can. It's a thimble. So when I was, I think, senior year of high school, I think I found this. I grew up in Ohio, and there's a lot of flea markets in Ohio, and I found this at a flea market. It's actually it's stamped Japan. I think it's just a brass thimble from Japan. I love the way it looked, and I asked my dad to use his drill press to put a hole through it.
There you go.
And so I've been wearing it ever since then. I wore, yeah, and I used to wear this little. This might have been like my dad's or something. I don't know, but I just wear it all the time.
There's a question, would your 10 or 15-year-old self be surprised that you are a hand sewer now?
My 15-year-old self would not be surprised. She'd be really excited. My 10-year-old self probably also wouldn't be surprised, actually, because I was always interested in history and fashion.
While I have a chance, I had a question about one of the fabrics that showed up. It was very iridescent, almost like a purplish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, it was probably the fabric that we used for the Morning Ramble recreation. That was fabric that we had custom woven for us in England to be the correct width, because silk tended to be woven narrower than it is today. And it's actually just shot to silk. So it's one direction is more of like a lavender color, and then there's like a more of a pale white or pink that's shot across it. And it was known as shot silk in the 18th century, and it is a textile that was that existed. And it gives it that gorgeous.
Yeah.
It changes. It was also called changeable silk because it literally changes with the light.
Let's see. Where would you recommend looking for information about appropriate clothing for a specific time period?
I would first ask what time period you're looking for, because there's so many people out there who are really into like niche time periods. And you'll get better information if you find someone who's really focused on one time period than someone who's more of a generalist.
All right.
So,
yeah. A couple comments. And that's the end of questions, unless someone sneaks one in. Oh, nope. Now I really want to learn how to hand sew. Great.
Couldn't ask for a better compliment than that.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Lots of nice comments. Oh, is there any batiste fabric that you like to use? And what's a good cotton fabric for modern clothing?
Let's see here. So yeah, I mean, if you go to any kind of like French hand sewing site, they all have like very good high quality cotton batiste. There's a place called Textile Fabrics in Nashville, Tennessee. They have a really lovely selection of fine cottons. I'm using cotton batiste right now, but it was sent to me by someone who did French hand sewing, and it was like in her stash. But it's not batiste, but it's still like a high quality cotton. There's this really great fabric store called Warp and Weft, and she sells a really lovely selection of different types of cottons that are not like this type of cotton. It's like not as fine. Well, she does sell, I think, some finer Indian cotton. A lot of her cotton is Japanese. But Warp and Weft, I would definitely suggest taking a look. And then also Tatter.org sells the cotton that I'm wearing today, which is really, really, it's not sheer, it's just really, really lightweight. So French Hand Sewing, Tatter.org, and Warp and Weft.
Great. All right, looks like it's slowed down.
Yeah, any other questions from anyone? I don't see any. All right, Sarah, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
It was great.
Yeah, it really was. It really was.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so yeah, we'll get this recording up on the website at some point soon. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.
All righty.